Book 1, Chapter 3, Part 1 of The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. Book 1, Mrs. Baines. Chapter 3. A Battle. 1. The day sanctioned by custom in the Five Towns for the making of pastry is Saturday, but Mrs. Baines made her pastry on Friday, because Saturday afternoon was, of course, a busy time in the shop. It is true that Mrs. Baines made her pastry in the morning, and that Saturday morning in the shop was scarcely different from any other morning. Nevertheless, Mrs. Baines made her pastry on Friday morning instead of Saturday morning, because Saturday afternoon was a busy time in the shop. She was thus free to do her marketing without breathtaking flurry on Saturday morning. On the morning after Sophia's first essay in dentistry, therefore, Mrs. Baines was making her pastry in the underground kitchen. This kitchen, Maggie's cavern home, had the mystery of a church, and on dark days it had the mystery of a crypt. The stone steps leading down to it from the level of earth were quite unlighted. You felt for them with the feet of faith, and when you arrived in the kitchen, by contrast, seemed luminous and gay. The architect may have considered and intended this effect of the staircase. The kitchen saw day through a wide, shallow window, whose top touched the ceiling, and whose bottom had been out of the girls' reach until long after they had begun to go to school. Its panes were small, and about half of them were of the knot kind, through which no object could be distinguished. The other half were of a later date, and stood for the march of civilization. The view from the window consisted of the vast plate-glass windows of the newly built sun vaults, and of passing legs and skirts. A strong wire grating prevented any excess of illumination, and also protected the glass from the caprices of wayfarers in King Street. Boys had a habit of stopping to kick with their full strength at the grating. Forget-me-nots on a brown field ornamented the walls of the kitchen. Its ceiling was irregular and grimy, and a beam ran across it. In this beam were two hooks. From these hooks had once depended the ropes of a swing, much used by Constance and Sophia in the old days before they were grown up. A large range stood out from the wall between the stairs and the window. The rest of the furniture comprised a table, against the wall opposite the range, a cupboard, and two Windsor chairs. Opposite the foot of the steps was a doorway, without a door, leading to two larders, dimmer even than the kitchen, vague retreats made visible by whitewash, where bowls of milk, dishes of cold bones, and remainders of fruit pies reposed on stillages. In the corner nearest the kitchen was a great stein, in which the bread was kept. Another doorway, on the other side of the kitchen, led to the first coal cellar, where was also the slopstone and tap, and thence a tunnel took you to the second coal cellar, where the coke and ashes were stored. The tunnel proceeded to a distant infinitesimal yard, and from the yard, by ways behind Mr. Critchlow's shop, you could finally emerge, astonished, upon Broom Street. The sense of the vast obscure of those regions, which began at the top of the kitchen steps, and ended in black corners of larders, or abruptly in the common dailiness of Broom Street, a sense which Constance and Sophia had acquired in infancy, remained with them almost unimpaired as they grew old. Mrs. Baines wore black alpaca, shielded by a white apron whose string drew attention to the amplitude of her waist. Her sleeves were turned up, and her hands, as far as the knuckles, covered with damp flour. Her ageless, smooth pasteboard occupied a corner of the table, and near it were her paste roller, butter, some pie dishes, shredded apples, sugar, and other things. Those rosy hands were at work among a sticky substance in a large white bowl. "Mother, are you there?" she heard a voice from above. "Yes, my chuck." Footsteps, apparently reluctant and hesitating, clinked on the stairs, and Sophia entered the kitchen. Put this curl straight," said Mrs. Baines, lowering her head slightly and holding up her floured hands, which might not touch anything but flour. "Thank you, it bothered me. And now stand out of my light. I'm in a hurry. I must get into the shop so that I can send Mr. Povey off to the dentist's. What is Constance doing?" "Helping Maggie to make Mr. Povey's bed." "Oh." Though fat, Mrs. Baines was a comely woman, with fine brown hair and confidently calm eyes that indicated her belief in her own capacity to accomplish whatever she could be called on to accomplish. She looked neither more nor less than her age, which was 45. She was not a native of the district, having been culled by her husband from the moorland town of Axe, 12 miles off. Like nearly all women who settle in a strange land upon marriage, at the bottom of her heart she had considered herself just a trifle superior to the strange land and its ways. This feeling, confirmed by long experience, had never left her. It was this feeling which induced her to continue making her own pastry, with 2 thoroughly trained great girls in the house. Constance could make good pastry, but it was not her mother's pastry. In pastry making everything can be taught except the hand, light and firm, which wields the roller. One is born with this hand or without it, and if one is born without it, the highest flights of pastry are impossible. Constance was born without it. There were days when Sophia seemed to possess it, but there were other days when Sophia's pastry was uneatable by anyone except Maggie. Thus Mrs. Baines, though intensely proud and fond of her daughters, had justifiably preserved a certain condescension towards them. She honestly doubted whether either of them would develop into the equal of their mother. "Now, you little vixen!" she exclaimed. Sophia was stealing and eating slices of half-cooked apple. "This comes of having no breakfast. And why didn't you come down to supper last night?" "I don't know. I forgot." Mrs. Baines scrutinized the child's eyes, which met hers with a sort of diffident boldness. She knew everything that a mother can know of a daughter, and she was sure that Sophia had no cause to be indisposed. Therefore she scrutinized those eyes with a faint apprehension. "If you can't find anything better to do," said she, "butter me the inside of this dish. Are your hands clean? No. Better not touch it." Mrs. Baines was now at the stage of depositing little pats of butter in rows on a large plane of paste, the best fresh butter. Cooking butter, to say naught of lard, was unknown in that kitchen on Friday mornings. She doubled the expanse of paste on itself and rolled the butter in. Supreme operation. "Constance has told you about leaving school?" said Mrs. Baines, in the vein of small talk, as she trimmed the paste to the shape of a pie dish. "Yes," Sophia replied shortly. Then she moved away from the table to the range. There was a toasting fork on the rack, and she began to play with it. "Well, are you glad? Your Aunt Harriet thinks you are quite old enough to leave, and as we decided in any case that Constance was to leave, it's really much simpler that you should both leave together." "Mother," said Sophia, rattling the toasting fork, "what am I going to do after I've left school?" "I hope," Mrs. Baines answered, with that sententiousness which even the cleverest of parents are not always clever enough to deny themselves, "I hope that both of you will do what you can to help your mother and father," she added. "Yes," said Sophia, irritated, "but what am I going to do?" "That must be considered. As Constance is to learn the millinery, I've been thinking that you might begin to make yourself useful in the underwear, gloves, silks, and so on. Then between you, you would one day be able to manage quite nicely all that side of the shop, and I should be—" "I don't want to go into the shop, mother." This interruption was made in a voice apparently cold and inimical, but Sophia trembled with nervous excitement as she uttered the words. Mrs. Baines gave a brief glance at her, unobserved by the child, whose face was towards the fire. She deemed herself a finished expert in the reading of Sophia's moods. Nevertheless, as she looked at that straight back and proud head, she had no suspicion that the whole essence and being of Sophia was silently but intensely imploring sympathy. "I wish you'd be quiet with that fork," said Mrs. Baines, with the curious prim politeness which often characterised her relations with her daughters. The toasting fork fell on the brick floor, and having rebounded from the ash tin, Sophia hurriedly replaced it on the rack. "Then what shall you do?" Mrs. Baines proceeded, conquering the annoyance caused by the toasting fork. "I think it's me that should ask you, instead of you asking me. What shall you do? Your father and I were both hoping you would take kindly to the shop and try to repay us for all the—" Mrs. Baines was unfortunate in her phrasing that morning. She happened to be, in truth, rather an exceptional parent, but that morning she seemed unable to avoid the absurd pretensions which parents of those days assumed quite sincerely, and which every good child with meekness accepted. Sophia was not a good child, and she obstinately denied in her heart the cardinal principle of family life, namely, that the parent has conferred on the offspring a supreme favour by bringing it into the world. She interrupted her mother again, rudely. "I don't want to leave school at all," she said, passionately. "But you will have to leave school sooner or later," argued Mrs. Baines, with an air of quiet reasoning, of putting herself on a level with Sophia. "You can't stay at school for ever, my pet, can you? Out of my way." She hurried across the kitchen with a pie, which she whipped into the oven, shutting the iron door with a careful gesture. "Yes," said Sophia, "I should like to be a teacher. That's what I want to be." The tap in the coal cellar, out of repair, could be heard distinctly and systematically dropping water into a jar on the slopstone. "A school teacher?" inquired Mrs. Baines. "Of course. What other kind is there?" said Sophia sharply. "With Miss Chetwynd." "I don't think your father would like that," Mrs. Baines replied. "I'm sure he wouldn't like it." "Why not?" "It wouldn't be quite suitable." "Why not, mother?" the girl demanded, with a sort of ferocity. She had now quitted the range. A man's feet twinkled past the window. Mrs. Baines was startled and surprised. Sophia's attitude was really very trying. Her manners deserved correction. But it was not these phenomena which seriously affected Mrs. Baines. She was used to them, and had come to regard them as somehow the inevitable accompaniment of Sophia's beauty, as the penalty of that surpassing charm which occasionally emanated from the girl like a radiance. What startled and surprised Mrs. Baines was the perfect and unthinkable madness of Sophia's infantile scheme. It was a revelation to Mrs. Baines. Why, in the name of heaven, had the girl taken such a notion into her head? Orphans, widows, and spinsters of a certain age, suddenly thrown on the world, these were the women who naturally became teachers, because they had to become something. But that the daughter of comfortable parents, surrounded by love and the pleasures of an excellent home, should wish to teach in a school, was beyond the horizons of Mrs. Baines's common sense. Comfortable parents of today, who have a difficulty in sympathizing with Mrs. Baines, should picture what their feelings would be if their Sophias showed a rude desire to adopt the vocation of chauffeur. "It would take you too much away from home," said Mrs. Baines, achieving a second pie. She spoke softly. The experience of being Sophia's mother for nearly 16 years had not been lost on Mrs. Baines. And though she was now discovering undreamt of dangers in Sophia's erratic temperament, she kept her presence of mind sufficiently well to behave with diplomatic smoothness. It was undoubtedly humiliating to a mother to be forced to use diplomacy in dealing with a girl in short sleeves. In her day, mothers had been autocrats. But Sophia was Sophia. "What if it did?" Sophia curtly demanded. "Miss Chetwynd would have me, and then after a time I could go to her sister." "Her sister? What sister?" "Her sister that has a big school in London somewhere." Mrs. Baines covered her unprecedented emotions by gazing into the oven at the first pie. The pie was doing well under all the circumstances. In those few seconds she reflected rapidly, and decided that to a desperate disease a desperate remedy must be applied. London! She herself had never been further than Manchester. London, after a time! No diplomacy would be misplaced in this crisis of Sophia's development. "Sophia," she said, in a changed and solemn voice, fronting her daughter and holding away from her apron those floured, ringed hands. "I don't know what's come over you, truly I don't. Your father and I are prepared to put up with a certain amount, but the line must be drawn. The fact is, we've spoilt you, and instead of getting better as you grow up, you're getting worse. Now, let me hear no more of this, please. I wish you would imitate your sister a little more. Of course, if you won't do your share in the shop, no one can make you. If you choose to be an idler about the house, we shall have to endure it. We can only advise you for your own good. But as for this—" She stopped and let silence speak, and then finished. "Let me hear no more of it." It was a powerful and impressive speech, enunciated clearly in such a tone as Mrs. Baines had not employed since dismissing a young lady assistant 5 years ago for light conduct. "But, mother—" A commotion of pails resounded at the top of the stone steps. It was Maggie in descent from the bedrooms. Now the Baines family passed its life in doing its best to keep its affairs to itself, the assumption being that Maggie and all the shop staff, Mr. Povey possibly excepted, were obsessed by a ravening appetite for that which did not concern them. Therefore the voices of the Baineses always died away, or fell to a hushed, mysterious whisper, whenever the foot of the eavesdropper was heard. Mrs. Baines put a floured finger to her double chin. "That will do," said she with finality. Maggie appeared, and Sophia, with a brusque precipitation of herself, vanished upstairs. 2. "Now, really, Mr. Povey, this is not like you," said Mrs. Baines, who, on her way into the shop, had discovered the indispensable in the cutting-out room. It is true that the cutting-out room was almost Mr. Povey's sanctum, whither he retired from time to cut out suits of clothes and odd garments for the tailoring department. It is true that the tailoring department flourished with orders, employing several tailors who crossed legs in their own homes, and that appointments were continually being made with customers for trying on in that room. But these considerations did not affect Mrs. Baines's attitude of disapproval. "I'm just cutting out that suit for the minister," said Mr. Povey. The Reverend Mr. Merley, superintendent of the Wesleyan Methodist circuit, called on Mr. Baines every week. On a recent visit, Mr. Baines had remarked that the parson's coat was ageing into green, and had commanded that a new suit should be built and presented to Mr. Merley. Mr. Merley, who had a genuine mediaeval passion for souls, and who spent his money and health freely in gratifying the passion, had accepted the offer strictly on behalf of Christ, and had carefully explained to Mr. Povey Christ's use for multifarious pockets. "I see you are," said Mrs. Baines tartly, "but that's no reason why you should be without a coat, and in this cold room too, you with toothache." The fact was that Mr. Povey always doffed his coat when cutting out. Instead of a coat he wore a tape measure. "My tooth doesn't hurt me," said he sheepishly, dropping the great scissors and picking up a cake of chalk. "Fiddlesticks!" said Mrs. Baines. The exclamation shocked Mr. Povey. It was not unknown on the lips of Mrs. Baines, but she usually reserved it for members of her own sex. Mr. Povey could not recall that she had ever applied it to any statement of his. "What's the matter with the woman?" he thought. The redness of her face did not help him to answer the question, for her face was always red after the operations of Friday in the kitchen. "You men are all alike," Mrs. Baines continued. "The very thought of the dentist cures you. Why don't you go in at once to Mr. Critchlow and have it out, like a man?" Mr. Critchlow extracted teeth, and his shop sign said "Bone setter and chemist." But Mr. Povey had his views. "I make no account of Mr. Critchlow as a dentist," said he. "Then for goodness' sake go to Oulsnam's." "When? I can't very well go now, and to-morrow is Saturday." "Why can't you go now?" "Well, of course I could go now," he admitted. "Let me advise you to go then, and don't come back with that tooth in your head. I shall be having you laid up next. Show some pluck, do." "Oh, pluck!" he protested, hurt. At that moment Constance came down the passage, singing. "Constance, my pet," Mrs. Baines called. "Yes, mother." She put her head into the room. "Oh!" Mr. Povey was assuming his coat. "Mr. Povey is going to the dentist's." "Yes, I'm going at once," Mr. Povey confirmed. "Oh, I'm so glad!" Constance exclaimed. Her face expressed a pure sympathy, uncomplicated by critical sentiments. Mr. Povey rapidly bathed in that sympathy, and then decided that he must show himself a man of oak and iron. "It's always best to get these things done with," said he, with stern detachment. "I'll just slip my overcoat on." "Here it is," said Constance quickly. Mr. Povey's overcoat and hat were hung on a hook immediately outside the room in the passage. She gave him the overcoat, anxious to be of service. "I didn't call you in here to be Mr. Povey's valet," said Mrs. Baines to herself with mild grimness, and aloud, "I can't stay in the shop long, Constance, but you can be there, can't you, till Mr. Povey comes back? And if anything happens, run up and tell me." "Yes, mother." Constance eagerly consented. She hesitated, and then turned to obey at once. "I want to speak to you first, my pet." Mrs. Baines stopped her, and her tone was peculiar, charged with import, confidential, and therefore very flattering to Constance. "I think I'll go out by the side door," said Mr. Povey. "It'll be nearer." This was truth. He would save about 10 yards in 2 miles by going out through the side door instead of through the shop. Who could have guessed that he was ashamed to be seen going to the dentist's, afraid lest, if he went through the shop, Mrs. Baines might follow him and utter some remark prejudicial to his dignity before the assistants? Mrs. Baines could have guessed, and did. "You won't want that tape measure," said Mrs. Baines dryly, as Mr. Povey dragged open the side door. The ends of the forgotten tape measure were dangling beneath coat and overcoat. "Oh!" Mr. Povey scowled at his forgetfulness. "I'll put it in its place," said Constance, offering to receive the tape measure. "Thank you," said Mr. Povey gravely. "I don't suppose they'll be long over my bit of a job," he added, with a difficult, miserable smile. Then he went off down King Street, with an exterior of gay briskness and dignified joy in the fine May morning. But there was no May morning in his cowardly human heart. "Hi, Povey!" cried a voice from the square. But Mr. Povey disregarded all appeals. He had put his hand to the plough, and he would not look back. "Hi, Povey!" Useless. Mrs. Baines and Constance were both at the door. A middle-aged man was crossing the road from Bolton Terrace, the lofty erection of new shops which the envious rest of the square had decided to call showy. He waved a hand to Mrs. Baines, who kept the door open. "It's Dr. Harrop," she said to Constance. "I shouldn't be surprised if that baby's come at last, and he wanted to tell Mr. Povey." Constance blushed, full of pride. Mrs. Povey, wife of our Mr. Povey's renowned cousin, the high-class confectioner and baker in Bolton Terrace, was a frequent subject of discussion in the Baines family. But this was absolutely the first time that Mrs. Baines had acknowledged, in presence of Constance, the marked and growing change which had characterised Mrs. Povey's condition during the recent months. Such frankness on the part of her mother, coming after the decision about leaving school, proved indeed that Constance had ceased to be a mere girl. "Good morning, Doctor." The doctor, who carried a little bag and wore riding breeches, he was the last doctor in Bursley to abandon the saddle for the dog-cart, saluted and straightened his high black stock. "Morning. Morning, missy. Well, it's a boy." "What, yonder?" asked Mrs. Baines, indicating the confectioner's. Dr. Harrop nodded. "I wanted to inform him," said he, jerking his shoulder in the direction of the swaggering coward. "What did I tell you, Constance?" said Mrs. Baines, turning to her daughter. Constance's confusion was equal to her pleasure. The alert doctor had halted at the foot of the 2 steps, and with one hand in the pocket of his full-fall breeches, he gazed up, smiling out of little eyes, at the ample matron and the slender virgin. "Yes," he said, "been up most of the night. Difficult. It's all right, I hope?" "Oh yes, fine child. But he put his mother to some trouble for all that. Nothing fresh?" This time he lifted his eyes to indicate Mr. Baines's bedroom. "No," said Mrs. Baines, with a different expression. "Keeps cheerful?" "Yes." "Good. A very good morning to ye." He strode off towards his house, which was lower down the street. "I hope she'll turn over a new leaf now," observed Mrs. Baines to Constance, as she closed the door. Constance knew that her mother was referring to the confectioner's wife. She gathered that the hope was slight in the extreme. "What did you want to speak to me about, mother?" she asked, as a way out of her delicious confusion. "Shut that door," Mrs. Baines replied, pointing to the door which led to the passage, and while Constance obeyed, Mrs. Baines herself shut the staircase door. She then said in a low, guarded voice: "What's all this about Sophia wanting to be a schoolteacher?" "Wanting to be a schoolteacher?" Constance repeated in tones of amazement. "Yes. Hasn't she said anything to you?" "Not a word." "Well, I never! She wants to keep on with Miss Chetwynd and be a teacher." Mrs. Baines had half a mind to add that Sophia had mentioned London, but she restrained herself. There are some things which one cannot bring oneself to say. She added: "Instead of going into the shop." "I never heard of such a thing," Constance murmured brokenly, in the excess of her astonishment. She was rolling up Mr. Povey's tape measure. "Neither did I," said Mrs. Baines. "And shall you let her, mother?" "Neither your father nor I would ever dream of it," Mrs. Baines replied, with calm and yet terrible decision. "I only mentioned it to you because I thought Sophia would have told you something." "No, mother." As Constance put Mr. Povey's tape measure neatly away in its drawer under the cutting out counter, she thought how serious life was, what with babies and Sophias. She was very proud of her mother's confidence in her. This simple pride filled her ardent breast with a most agreeable commotion, and she wanted to help everybody, to show in some way how much she sympathized with and loved everybody. Even the madness of Sophia did not weaken her longing to comfort Sophia. 3. That afternoon there was a search for Sophia, whom no one had seen since dinner. She was discovered by her mother, sitting alone and unoccupied in the drawing-room. The circumstance was in itself sufficiently peculiar, for on weekdays the drawing-room was never used, even by the girls during their holidays, except for the purpose of playing the piano. However, Mrs. Baines offered no comment on Sophia's geographical situation, nor on her idleness. "My dear," she said, standing at the door, with a self-conscious effort to behave as though nothing had happened, "will you come and sit with your father a bit?" "Yes, mother," answered Sophia, with a sort of cold alacrity. "Sophia is coming, father," said Mrs. Baines at the open door of the bedroom, which was at right angles with, and close to, the drawing-room door. Then she surged swishing along the corridor, and went into the showroom, whither she had been called. Sophia passed to the bedroom, the eternal prison of John Baines. Although, on account of his nervous restlessness, Mr. Baines was never left alone, it was not a part of the usual duty of the girls to sit with him. The person who undertook the main portion of the vigils was a certain Aunt Maria, whom the girls knew not to be a real aunt, not a powerful, effective aunt like Aunt Harriet of Axe, but a poor second cousin of John Baines, one of those necessitous, pitiful relatives who so often make life difficult for a great family in a small town. The existence of Aunt Maria, after being rather a trial to the Baineses, had for 12 years past developed into something absolutely providential for them. It is to be remembered that in those days Providence was still busying himself with everybody's affairs, and foreseeing the future in the most extraordinary manner. Thus, having foreseen that John Baines would have a stroke and need a faithful, tireless nurse, he had begun 50 years in advance by creating Aunt Maria, and had kept her carefully in misfortune's way, so that at the proper moment she would be ready to cope with the stroke. Such, at least, is the only theory which will explain the use by the Baineses, and indeed by all thinking Bursley, of the word providential in connection with Aunt Maria. She was a shrivelled little woman, capable of sitting 12 hours a day in a bedroom and thriving on the regime. At nights she went home to her little cottage in Broome Street. She had her Thursday afternoons, and generally her Sundays, and during the school vacations she was supposed to come only when she felt inclined, or when the cleaning of her cottage permitted her to come. Hence, in holiday seasons, Mr. Baines weighed more heavily on his household than at other times, and his nurses relieved each other according to the contingencies of the moment, rather than by a set programme of hours. The tragedy in 10,000 acts, of which that bedroom was the scene, almost entirely escaped Sophia's perception, as it did Constance's. Sophia went into the bedroom as though it were a mere bedroom, with its majestic mahogany furniture, its crimson rep curtains edged with gold, and its white, heavily tasselled counterpane. She was aged 4 when John Baines had suddenly been seized with giddiness on the steps of his shop, and had fallen, and, without losing consciousness, had been transformed from John Baines into a curious and pathetic survival of John Baines. She had no notion of the thrill which ran through the town on that night when it was known that John Baines had had a stroke, and that his left arm and left leg and his right eyelid were paralysed, and that the active member of the local board, the orator, the religious worker, the very life of the town's life, was permanently done for. She had never heard of the crisis through which her mother, assisted by Aunt Harriet, had passed, and out of which she had triumphantly emerged. She was not yet old enough even to suspect it. She possessed only the vaguest memory of her father before he had finished with the world. She knew him simply as an organism on a bed, whose left side was wasted, whose eyes were often inflamed, whose mouth was crooked, who had no creases from the nose to the corners of the mouth like other people, who experienced difficulty in eating because the food would somehow get between his gums and his cheek, who slept a great deal, but was excessively fidgety while awake, who seemed to hear what was said to him a long time after it was uttered, as if the sense had to travel miles by labyrinthine passages to his brain, and who talked very, very slowly in a weak, trembling voice. And she had an image of that remote brain as something with a red spot on it, for once Constance had said, "Mother, why did father have a stroke?" And Mrs. Baines had replied, "It was a hemorrhage of the brain, my dear, here," putting a thimbled finger on a particular part of Sophia's head. Not merely had Constance and Sophia never really felt their father's tragedy, Mrs. Baines herself had largely lost the sense of it, such is the effect of use. Even the ruined organism only remembered fitfully and partially that it had once been John Baines, and if Mrs. Baines had not, by the habit of years, gradually built up a gigantic fiction that the organism remained ever the supreme consultative head of the family, if Mr. Critchlow had not obstinately continued to treat it as a crony, the mass of living and dead nerves on the rich Victorian bedstead would have been of no more account than some Aunt Maria in similar case. These two persons, his wife and his friend, just managed to keep him morally alive by indefatigably feeding his importance and his dignity. The feat was a miracle of stubborn, self-deceiving, splendidly blind devotion and incorrigible pride. When Sophia entered the room, the paralytic followed her with his nervous gaze until she had sat down on the end of the sofa at the foot of the bed. He seemed to study her for a long time, and then he murmured in his slow, enfeebled, irregular voice, "Is that Sophia?" "Yes, father," she answered cheerfully. And after another pause the old man said, "Ay, it's Sophia." And later, "Your mother said she'd send ye." Sophia saw that this was one of his bad, dull days. He had, occasionally, days of comparative nimbleness, when his wit seized almost easily the meanings of external phenomena. Presently his sallow face and long white beard began to slip down the steep slant of the pillows, and a troubled look came into his left eye. Sophia rose, and putting her hands under his armpits, lifted him higher in the bed. He was not heavy, but only a strong girl of her years could have done it. "Ay," he muttered, "that's it, that's it." And with his controllable right hand he took her hand as she stood by the bed. She was so young and fresh, such an incarnation of the spirit of health, and he was so far gone in decay and corruption, that there seemed in this contact of body with body something unnatural and repulsive. But Sophia did not so feel it. "Sophia," he addressed her, and made preparatory noises in his throat while she waited. He continued, after an interval, now clutching her arm: "Your mother's been telling me you don't want to go in the shop." She turned her eyes on him, and his anxious, dim gaze met hers. She nodded. "Nay, Sophia," he mumbled, with the extreme of slowness, "I'm surprised at ye. Trade's bad, bad. You know trade's bad." He was still clutching her arm. She nodded. She was, in fact, aware of the badness of trade, caused by a vague war in the United States. The words North and South had a habit of recurring in the conversation of adult persons. That was all she knew, though people were starving in the Five Towns, as they were starving in Manchester. "There's your mother." His thoughts struggled on like an aged horse over a hilly road. "There's your mother," he repeated, as if wishful to direct Sophia's attention to the spectacle of her mother. "Working hard. Constance, and you must help her. Trade's bad. What can I do, lying here?" The heat from his dry fingers was warming her arm. She wanted to move, but she could not have withdrawn her arm without appearing impatient. For a similar reason, she would not avert her glance. A deepening flush increased the lustre of her immature loveliness as she bent over him. But though it was so close, he did not feel that radiance. He had long outlived a susceptibility to the strange influences of youth and beauty. "Teaching," he muttered. "Nay, I canna allow that." Then his white beard rose at the tip, as he looked up at the ceiling above his head reflectively. "You understand me?" he questioned finally. She nodded again. He loosed her arm, and she turned away. She could not have spoken. Glittering tears enriched her eyes. She was saddened into a profound and sudden grief by the ridiculousness of the scene. She had youth, physical perfection; she brimmed with energy, with a sense of vital power. All existence lay before her. When she put her lips together, she felt capable of outvieing no matter whom in fortitude of resolution. She had always hated the shop. She did not understand how her mother and Constance could bring themselves to be deferential and flattering to every customer that entered. No, she did not understand it. But her mother, though a proud woman, and Constance, seemed to practise such behaviour so naturally, so unquestioningly, that she had never imparted to either of them her feelings. She guessed that she would not be comprehended. But long ago she had decided that she would never go into the shop. She knew that she would be expected to do something, and she had fixed on teaching as the one possibility. These decisions had formed part of her inner life for years past. She had not mentioned them, being secretive and scarcely anxious for unpleasantness, but she had been slowly preparing herself to mention them. The extraordinary announcement that she was to leave school at the same time as Constance had taken her unawares, before the preparations ripening in her mind were complete, before, as it were, she had girded up her loins for the fray. She had been caught unready, and the opposing forces had obtained the advantage of her. But did they suppose she was beaten? No argument from her mother, no hearing even, just a curt and haughty "let me hear no more of this." And so the great desire of her life, nourished year after year in her inmost bosom, was to be flouted and sacrificed with a word. Her mother did not appear ridiculous in the affair, for her mother was a genuine power, commanding by turns genuine love and genuine hate, and always, till then, obedience and the respect of reason. It was her father who appeared tragically ridiculous, and in turn the whole movement against her grew grotesque in its absurdity. Here was this antique wreck, helpless, useless, powerless, merely pathetic, actually thinking that he had only to mumble in order to make her understand. He knew nothing, he perceived nothing, he was a ferocious egoist, like most bedridden invalids, out of touch with life. and he thought himself justified in making destinies and capable of making them. Sophia could not perhaps define the feelings which overwhelmed her, but she was conscious of their tendency. They aged her by years. They aged her so that in a kind of momentary ecstasy of insight she felt older than her father himself. "You'll be a good girl," he said. "I'm sure of that." It was too painful. The grotesqueness of her father's complacency humiliated her past bearing. She was humiliated, not for herself, but for him. Singular creature! She ran out of the room. Fortunately, Constance was passing in the corridor, otherwise Sophia had been found guilty of a great breach of duty. "Go to father," she whispered hysterically to Constance, and fled upwards to the second floor. End of Chapter 3, Part 1. Book 1, Chapter 3, Part 2 of The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. Book 1, Mrs. Baines. Chapter 3. A Battle. 4. At supper, with her red, downcast eyes, she had returned to sheer girlishness again, overawed by her mother. The meal had an unusual aspect. Mr. Povey, safe from the dentist, but having lost 2 teeth in 2 days, was being fed on slops, bread and milk, to wit. He sat near the fire. The others had cold pork, half a cold apple pie, and cheese, but Sophia only pretended to eat. Each time she tried to swallow, the tears came into her eyes, and her throat shut itself up. Mrs. Baines and Constance had a too careful air of eating just as usual. Mrs. Baines's handsome ringlets dominated the table under the gas. "I'm not so set up with my pastry to-day," observed Mrs. Baines, critically munching a fragment of pie crust. She rang a little handbell. Maggie appeared from the cave. She wore a plain white bibless apron, but no cap. "Maggie, will you have some pie?" "Yes, if you can spare it, ma'am." This was Maggie's customary answer to offers of food. "We can always spare it, Maggie," said her mistress as usual. "Sophia, if you aren't going to use that plate, give it to me." Maggie disappeared with liberal pie. Mrs. Baines then talked to Mr. Povey about his condition, and in particular as to the need for precautions against taking cold in the bereaved gum. She was a brave and determined woman. From start to finish she behaved as though nothing whatever in the household, except her pastry and Mr. Povey, had deviated that day from the normal. She kissed Constance and Sophia with the most exact equality, and called them "my chucks" when they went up to bed. Constance, excellent kind heart, tried to imitate her mother's tactics as the girls undressed in their room. She thought she could not do better than ignore Sophia's deplorable state. "Mother's new dress is quite finished, and she's going to wear it on Sunday," said she, blandly. "If you say another word, I'll scratch your eyes out." Sophia turned on her viciously, with a catch in her voice, and then began to sob at intervals. She did not mean this threat, but its utterance gave her relief. Constance, faced with the fact that her mother's shoes were too big for her, decided to preserve her eyesight. Long after the gas was out, rare sobs from Sophia shook the bed, and they both lay awake in silence. "I suppose you and mother have been talking me over finely to-day?" Sophia burst forth, to Constance's surprise, in a wet voice. "No," said Constance soothingly. "Mother only told me." "Told you what?" "That you wanted to be a teacher." "And I will be too," said Sophia bitterly. "You don't know mother," thought Constance, but she made no audible comment. There was another detached, hard sob, and then, such is the astonishing talent of youth, they both fell asleep. The next morning, early, Sophia stood gazing out of the window at the square. It was Saturday, and all over the square little stalls with yellow linen roofs were being erected for the principal market of the week. In those barbaric days, Bursley had a majestic edifice, black as basalt, for the sale of dead animals by the limb and rib. It was entitled the Shambles, but vegetables, fruit, cheese, eggs, and pikelets were still sold under canvas. Eggs are now offered at 5 farthings apiece in a palace that cost £25,000. Yet you will find people in Bursley ready to assert that things generally are not what they were, and that in particular the romance of life has gone. But until it has gone, it is never romance. To Sophia, though she was in a mood which usually stimulates the sense of the romantic, there was nothing of romance in this picturesque tented field. It was just the market. Hull's, the leading grocer's, was already open at the extremity of the square, and a boy apprentice was sweeping the pavement in front of it. The public houses were open, several of them specialising in hot rum at 5:30 a.m. The town crier, in his blue coat with red facings, crossed the square, carrying his big bell by the tongue. There was the same shocking hole in one of Mrs. Povey's, confectioner's, window curtains, a hole which even her recent travail could scarcely excuse. Such matters it was that Sophia noticed with dull, smarting eyes. "Sophia, you'll take your death of cold standing there like that." She jumped. The voice was her mother's. That vigorous woman, after a calm night by the side of the paralytic, was already up and neatly dressed. She carried a bottle and an egg cup, and a small quantity of jam in a tablespoon. "Get into bed again, do, there's a dear. You're shivering." White Sophia obeyed. It was true, she was shivering. Constance awoke. Mrs. Baines went to the dressing table and filled the egg cup out of the bottle. "What's that for, mother?" Constance asked sleepily. "It's for Sophia," said Mrs. Baines with good cheer. "Now, Sophia," and she advanced with the egg cup in one hand and the tablespoon in the other. "What is it, mother?" asked Sophia, who well knew what it was. "Castor oil, my dear," said Mrs. Baines winningly. The ludicrousness of attempting to cure obstinacy and yearnings for a freer life by means of castor oil is perhaps less real than apparent. The strange interdependence of spirit and body, though only understood intelligently in these intelligent days, was guessed at by sensible mediaeval mothers. And certainly, at the period when Mrs. Baines represented modernity, castor oil was still the remedy of remedies. It had supplanted cupping, and if part of its vogue was due to its extreme unpleasantness, it had at least proved its qualities in many a contest with disease. Less than 2 years previously, old Dr. Harrop, father of him who told Mrs. Baines about Mrs. Povey, being then aged 86, had fallen from top to bottom of his staircase. He had scrambled up, taken a dose of castor oil at once, and on the morrow was as well as if he had never seen a staircase. This episode was town property, and had sunk deep into all hearts. "I don't want any, mother," said Sophia in dejection. "I'm quite well." "You simply ate nothing all day yesterday," said Mrs. Baines, and she added, "Come," as if to say, "There's always this silly fuss with castor oil. Don't keep me waiting." "I don't want any," said Sophia, irritated and captious. The two girls lay side by side on their backs. They seemed very thin and fragile in comparison with the solidity of their mother. Constance wisely held her peace. Mrs. Baines put her lips together, meaning, "This is becoming tedious. I shall have to be angry in another moment." "Come," said she again. The girls could hear her foot tapping on the floor. "I really don't want it, mamma," Sophia thought. "I suppose I ought to know whether I need it or not." This was insolence. "Sophia, will you take this medicine, or won't you?" In conflicts with her children, the mother's ultimatum always took the formula in which this phrase was cast. The girls knew, when things had arrived at the pitch of "or won't you," spoken in Mrs. Baines's firmest tone, that the end was upon them. Never had the ultimatum failed. There was a silence. "And I'll thank you to mind your manners," Mrs. Baines added. "I won't take it," said Sophia sullenly and flatly, and she hid her face in the pillow. It was a historic moment in the family life. Mrs. Baines thought the last day had come, but still she held herself in dignity while the apocalypse roared in her ears. "Of course I can't force you to take it," she said with superb evenness, masking anger by compassionate grief. "You're a big girl and a naughty girl, and if you will be ill, you must." Upon this immense admission, Mrs. Baines departed. Constance trembled. Nor was that all. In the middle of the morning, when Mrs. Baines was pricing new potatoes at a stall at the top end of the square, and Constance choosing 3 pennyworth of flowers at the same stall, whom should they see, walking all alone across the empty corner by the bank, but Sophia Baines? The square was busy and populous, and Sophia was only visible behind a foreground of restless, chattering figures, but she was unmistakably seen. She had been beyond the square and was returning. Constance could scarcely believe her eyes. Mrs. Baines's heart jumped, for let it be said that the girls never, under any circumstances, went forth without permission, and scarcely ever alone. That Sophia should be at large in the town, without leave, without notice, exactly as if she were her own mistress, was a proposition which a day earlier had been inconceivable. Yet there she was, and moving with a leisureliness that must be described as effrontery. Red with apprehension, Constance wondered what would happen. Mrs. Baines said naught of her feelings, did not even indicate that she had seen the scandalous, the breathtaking sight. And they descended the square, laden with the lighter portions of what they had bought during an hour of buying. They went into the house by the King Street door, and the first thing they heard was the sound of the piano upstairs. Nothing happened. Mr. Povey had his dinner alone. Then the table was laid for them, and the bell rung, and Sophia came insolently downstairs to join her mother and sister. And nothing happened. The dinner was silently eaten, and Constance having rendered thanks to God, Sophia rose abruptly to go. "Sophia!" "Yes, mother?" "Constance, stay where you are," said Mrs. Baines suddenly to Constance, who had meant to flee. Constance was therefore destined to be present at the happening, doubtless in order to emphasise its importance and seriousness. "Sophia," Mrs. Baines resumed to her younger daughter in an ominous voice. "No, please shut the door. There's no reason why everybody in the house should hear. Come right into the room. Right in. That's it. Now, what were you doing out in the town this morning?" Sophia was fidgeting nervously with the edge of her little black apron, and worrying a seam of the carpet with her toes. She bent her head towards her left shoulder, at first smiling vaguely. She said nothing, but every limb, every glance, every curve was speaking. Mrs. Baines sat firmly in her own rocking chair, full of the sensation that she had Sophia, as it were, writhing on the end of a skewer. Constance was braced into a moveless anguish. "I will have an answer," pursued Mrs. Baines. "What were you doing out in the town this morning?" "I just went out," answered Sophia at length, still with eyes downcast, and in a rather simpering tone. "Why did you go out? You said nothing to me about going out. I heard Constance ask you if you were coming with us to the market, and you said, very rudely, that you weren't." "I didn't say it rudely," Sophia objected. "Yes, you did, and I'll thank you not to answer back." "I didn't mean to say it rudely, did I, Constance?" Sophia's head turned sharply to her sister. Constance knew not where to look. "Don't answer back," Mrs. Baines repeated sternly. "And don't try to drag Constance into this, for I won't have it." "Oh, of course Constance is always right," observed Sophia, with an irony whose unparalleled impudence shook Mrs. Baines to her massive foundations. "Do you want me to have to smack you, child?" Her temper flashed out, and you could see ringlets vibrating under the provocation of Sophia's sauciness. Then Sophia's lower lip began to fall and to bulge outwards, and all the muscles of her face seemed to slacken. "You are a very naughty girl," said Mrs. Baines with restraint. "I've got her," said Mrs. Baines to herself. "I may just as well keep my temper." And a sob broke out of Sophia. She was behaving like a little child. She bore no trace of the young maiden sedately crossing the square without leave and without an escort. "I knew she was going to cry," said Mrs. Baines, breathing relief. "I'm waiting," said Mrs. Baines aloud. A second sob. Mrs. Baines manufactured patience to meet the demand. "You tell me not to answer back, and then you say you're waiting," Sophia blubbered thickly. "What's that you say? How can I tell what you say if you talk like that?" But Mrs. Baines failed to hear out of discretion, which is better than valour. "It's of no consequence," Sophia blurted forth in a sob. She was weeping now, and tears were ricocheting off her lovely crimson cheeks onto the carpet. Her whole body was trembling. "Don't be a great baby," Mrs. Baines enjoined, with a touch of rough persuasiveness in her voice. "It's you who makes me cry," said Sophia bitterly. "You make me cry, and then you call me a great baby." And sobs ran through her frame like waves one after another. She spoke so indistinctly that her mother now really had some difficulty in catching her words. "Sophia," said Mrs. Baines, with godlike calm, "it is not I who makes you cry. It is your guilty conscience makes you cry. I have merely asked you a question, and I intend to have an answer." "I've told you." Here Sophia checked the sobs with an immense effort. "What have you told me?" "I just went out." "I will have no trifling," said Mrs. Baines. "What did you go out for, and without telling me? If you had told me afterwards, when I came in, of your own accord, it might have been different. But no, not a word. It is I who have to ask. Now, quick, I can't wait any longer." "I gave way over the castor oil, my girl," Mrs. Baines said in her own breast, "but not again, not again." "I don't know," Sophia murmured. "What do you mean, you don't know?" The sobbing recommenced tempestuously. "I mean, I don't know. I just went out." Her voice rose. It was noisy, but scarcely articulate. "What if I did go out?" "Sophia, I am not going to be talked to like this. If you think just because you're leaving school you can do exactly as you like..." "Do I want to leave school?" yelled Sophia, stamping. In a moment a hurricane of emotion overwhelmed her, as though that stamping of the foot had released the demons of the storm. Her face was transfigured by uncontrollable passion. "You all want to make me miserable," she shrieked with terrible violence, "and now I can't even go out. You're a horrid, cruel woman, and I hate you. And you can do what you like. Put me in prison if you like. I know you'd be glad if I was dead." She dashed from the room, banging the door with a shock that made the house rattle. And she had shouted so loud that she might have been heard in the shop, and even in the kitchen. It was a startling experience for Mrs. Baines. "Mrs. Baines, why did you saddle yourself with a witness? Why did you so positively say that you intended to have an answer?" "Really," she stammered, pulling her dignity about her shoulders like a garment that the wind has snatched off, "I never dreamt that poor girl had such a dreadful temper. What a pity it is, for her own sake." It was the best she could do. Constance, who could not bear to witness her mother's humiliation, vanished very quietly from the room. She got halfway upstairs to the second floor, and then, hearing the loud, rapid, painful, regular intake of sobbing breaths, she hesitated and crept down again. This was Mrs. Baines's first costly experience of the child thankless for having been brought into the world. It robbed her of her profound, absolute belief in herself. She had thought she knew everything in her house, and could do everything there, and lo! she had suddenly stumbled against an unsuspected personality at large in her house, a sort of hard marble affair that informed her by means of bumps that if she did not want to be hurt she must keep out of the way. 5. On the Sunday afternoon Mrs. Baines was trying to repose a little in the drawing room where she had caused a fire to be lighted. Constance was in the adjacent bedroom with her father. Sophia lay between blankets in the room overhead with a feverish cold. This cold and her new dress were Mrs. Baines's sole consolation at the moment. She had prophesied a cold for Sophia, refuser of castor oil, and it had come. Sophia had received, for standing in her night-dress at a draughty window of a May morning, what Mrs. Baines called nature's slap in the face. As for the dress, she had worshipped God in it, and prayed for Sophia in it before dinner, and its 4 double rows of gimp on the skirt had been accounted a great success. With her lace-bordered mantle and her low stringed bonnet, she had assuredly given a unique lustre to the congregation at chapel. She was stout, but the fashions, prescribing vague outlines, broad downward slopes, and vast amplitudes, were favourable to her shape. It must not be supposed that stout women of a certain age never seek to seduce the eye and trouble the meditations of man by other than moral charms. Mrs. Baines knew that she was comely, natty, imposing, and elegant, and the knowledge gave her real pleasure. She would look over her shoulder in the glass, as anxious as a girl, make no mistake. She did not repose. She could not. She sat thinking, in exactly the same posture as Sophia's 2 afternoons previously. She would have been surprised to hear that her attitude, bearing, and expression powerfully recalled those of her reprehensible daughter, but it was so. A good angel made her restless, and she went idly to the window and glanced upon the empty shuttered square. She, too, majestic matron, had strange brief yearnings for an existence more romantic than this, shootings across her spirit's firmament of tailed comets, soft, inexplicable melancholies. The good angel, withdrawing her from such a mood, directed her gaze to a particular spot at the top of the square. She passed at once out of the room, not precisely in a hurry, yet without wasting time. In a recess under the stairs, immediately outside the door, was a box about a foot square and 18 inches deep, covered with black American cloth. She bent down and unlocked this box, which was padded within and contained the Baines silver tea service. She drew from the box a teapot, sugar bowl, milk jug, sugar tongs, hot water jug, and cake stand, a flattish dish with an arching semicircular handle, chased vessels, silver without and silver gilt within, glittering heirlooms that shone in the dark corner like the secret pride of respectable families. These she put on a tray that always stood on end in the recess. Then she looked upwards through the banisters to the second floor. "Maggie!" she piercingly whispered. "Yes, ma'am," came a voice. "Are you dressed?" "Yes, ma'am, I'm just coming." "Well, put on your muslin apron," Mrs. Baines implied. Maggie understood. "Take these for tea," said Mrs. Baines when Maggie descended. "Better rub them over. You know where the cake is, that new one, the best cups, and the silver spoons." They both heard a knock at the side door, far off below. "There!" exclaimed Mrs. Baines. "Now take these right down into the kitchen before you open." "Yes, ma'am," said Maggie, departing. Mrs. Baines was wearing a black alpaca apron. She removed it and put on another one of black satin embroidered with yellow flowers, which, by merely inserting her arm into the chamber, she had taken off the chest of drawers in her bedroom. Then she fixed herself in the drawing-room. Maggie returned, rather short of breath, convoying the visitor. "Ah, Miss Chetwynd," said Mrs. Baines, rising to welcome. "I am sure I'm delighted to see you. I saw you coming down the square, and I said to myself, now I do hope Miss Chetwynd isn't going to forget us." Miss Chetwynd, simpering momentarily, came forward with that self-conscious, slightly histrionic air which is one of the penalties of pedagogy. She lived under the eyes of her pupils. Her life was one ceaseless effort to avoid doing anything which might influence her charges for evil or shock the natural sensitiveness of their parents. She had to wind her earthly way through a forest of the most delicate susceptibilities, fern fronds that stretched across the path, and that she must not even accidentally disturb with her skirt as she passed. No wonder she walked mincingly. No wonder she had a habit of keeping her elbows close to her sides and drawing her mantle tight in the streets. Her prospectus talked about a sound and religious course of training, study embracing the usual branches of English, with music by a talented master, drawing, dancing, and calisthenics. Also needlework, plain and ornamental. Also moral influence, and finally about terms, which are very moderate, and every particular, with references to parents and others, furnished on application. Sometimes, too, without application. As an illustration of the delicacy of fern fronds, that single word "dancing" had nearly lost her Constance and Sophia 7 years before. She was a pinched virgin, aged 40, and not well off. In her family the gift of success had been monopolised by her elder sister. For these characteristics Mrs. Baines, as a matron in easy circumstances, pitied Miss Chetwynd. On the other hand, Miss Chetwynd could choose ground from which to look down upon Mrs. Baines, who, after all, was in trade. Miss Chetwynd had no trace of the local accent. She spoke with a southern refinement, which the Five Towns, while making fun of it, envied. All her o's had a genteel leaning towards ow, as ritualism leans towards Romanism, and she was the fount of etiquette, a wonder of correctness, in the eyes of her pupils' parents, not so much a perfect lady as a perfect lady, so that it was an extremely nice question whether, upon the whole, Mrs. Baines secretly condescended to Miss Chetwynd, or Miss Chetwynd to Mrs. Baines. Perhaps Mrs. Baines, by virtue of her wifehood, carried the day. Miss Chetwynd, carefully and precisely seated, opened the conversation by explaining that even if Mrs. Baines had not written, she would have called in any case, as she made a practice of calling at the homes of her pupils in vacation time, which was true. Mrs. Baines, it should be stated, had on Friday afternoon sent to Miss Chetwynd one of her most luxurious notes, lavender-coloured paper with scalloped edges, the sweetest mode of the day, to announce in her Italian hand that Constance and Sophia would both leave school at the end of next term, and giving reasons in regard to Sophia. Before the visitor had got very far, Maggie came in with a lacquered tea caddy, and the silver teapot and a silver spoon on a lacquered tray. Mrs. Baines, while continuing to talk, chose a key from her bunch, unlocked the tea caddy, and transferred 4 teaspoonfuls of tea from it to the teapot, and relocked the caddy. "Strawberry," she mysteriously whispered to Maggie, and Maggie disappeared, bearing the tray and its contents. "And how is your sister? It's quite a long time since she was down here," Mrs. Baines went on to Miss Chetwynd, after whispering "strawberry." The remark was merely in the way of small talk, for the hostess felt a certain unwilling hesitation to approach the topic of daughters, but it happened to suit the social purpose of Miss Chetwynd to a nicety. Miss Chetwynd was a vessel brimming with great tidings. "She is very well, thank you," said Miss Chetwynd, and her expression grew exceedingly vivacious. Her face glowed with pride as she added, "Of course, everything is changed now." "Indeed?" murmured Mrs. Baines, with polite curiosity. "Yes," said Miss Chetwynd. "You've not heard?" "No," said Mrs. Baines. Miss Chetwynd knew that she had not heard. "About Elizabeth's engagement to the Reverend Archibald Jones?" It is the fact that Mrs. Baines was taken aback. She did nothing indiscreet. She did not give vent to her excusable amazement that the elder Miss Chetwynd should be engaged to anyone at all, as some woman would have done in the stress of the moment. She kept her presence of mind. "This is really most interesting," said she. It was, for Archibald Jones was one of the idols of the Wesleyan Methodist connection, a special preacher famous throughout England. At anniversaries and trust sermons Archibald Jones had probably no rival. His Christian name helped him. It was a luscious, resounding mouthful for admirers. He was not an itinerant minister, migrating every 3 years. His function was to direct the affairs of the book room, the publishing department of the connection. He lived in London, and shot out into the provinces at week ends, preaching on Sundays, and giving a lecture tinctured with bookishness in the chapel on Monday evenings. In every town he visited there was competition for the privilege of entertaining him. He had zeal, indefatigable energy, and a breezy wit. He was a widower of 50, and his wife had been dead for 20 years. It had seemed as if women were not for this bright star. And here Elizabeth Chetwynd, who had left the Five Towns a quarter of a century before at the age of 20, had caught him. Austere, moustached, formidable, desiccated, she must have done it with her powerful intellect. It must be a union of intellects. He had been impressed by hers, and she by his, and then their intellects had kissed. Within a week 50,000 women in 40 counties had pictured to themselves the osculation of intellects, and shrugged their shoulders, and decided once more that men were incomprehensible. These great ones in London, falling in love like the rest. But no, love was a ribald and voluptuous word to use in such a matter as this. It was generally felt that the Reverend Archibald Jones and Miss Chetwynd the elder would lift marriage to what would now be termed an astral plane. After tea had been served, Mrs. Baines gradually recovered her position, both in her own private esteem and in the deference of Miss Aileen Chetwynd. "Yes," said she, "you can talk about your sister, and you can call him Archibald, and you can mince up your words, but have you got a tea service like this? Can you conceive more perfect strawberry jam than this? Did not my dress cost more than you spend on your clothes in a year? Has a man ever looked at you? All in all, is there not something about my situation, in short, something?" She did not say this aloud. She in no way deviated from the scrupulous politeness of a hostess. There was nothing in even her tone to indicate that Mrs. John Baines was a personage. Yet it suddenly occurred to Miss Chetwynd that her pride in being the prospective sister-in-law of the Reverend Archibald Jones would be better for a while in her pocket, and she inquired after Mr. Baines. After this the conversation limped somewhat. "I suppose you weren't surprised by my letter?" said Mrs. Baines. "I was and I wasn't," answered Miss Chetwynd in her professional manner, and not her manner of a prospective sister-in-law. "Of course I'm naturally sorry to lose two such good pupils, but we can't keep our pupils for ever." She smiled. She was not without fortitude. It is easier to lose pupils than to replace them. "Still—" A pause. "What you say of Sophia is perfectly true, perfectly. She is quite as advanced as Constance. Still—" Another pause, and a more rapid enunciation. "Sophia is by no means an ordinary girl. I hope she hasn't been a very great trouble to you?" "Oh no!" exclaimed Miss Chetwynd. "Sophia and I have got on very well together. I have always tried to appeal to her reason. I have never forced her. Now, with some girls, in some ways I look upon Sophia as the most remarkable girl, not pupil, but the most remarkable, what shall I say, individuality that I have ever met with." And her demeanour added, "And mind you, this is something from me." "Indeed," said Mrs. Baines. She told herself, "I am not your common foolish parent. I see my children impartially. I am incapable of being flattered concerning them." Nevertheless, she was flattered, and the thought shaped itself that really Sophia was no ordinary girl. "I suppose she has talked to you about becoming a teacher?" asked Miss Chetwynd, taking a morsel of the unparalleled jam. She held the spoon with her thumb and 3 fingers. Her 4th finger, in matters of honest labour, would never associate with the other 3. Delicately curved, it always drew proudly away from them. "Has she mentioned this to you?" Mrs. Baines demanded, startled. "Oh yes," said Miss Chetwynd, "several times. Sophia is a very secretive girl, very, but I think I may say that I have always had her confidence. There have been times when Sophia and I have been very near each other. Elizabeth was much struck with her. Indeed, I may tell you that in one of her last letters to me she spoke of Sophia, and said that she had mentioned her to Mr. Jones, and that Mr. Jones remembered her quite well." Impossible for even a wise, uncommon parent not to be affected by such an announcement. "I dare say your sister will give up her school now," observed Mrs. Baines, to divert attention from her self-consciousness. "Oh no!" And this time Mrs. Baines had genuinely shocked Miss Chetwynd. "Nothing would induce Elizabeth to give up the cause of education. Archibald takes the keenest interest in the school. Oh no! Not for worlds." "Then you think Sophia would make a good teacher?" asked Mrs. Baines, with apparent inconsequence and with a smile. But the words marked an epoch in her mind. All was over. "I think that she is very much set on it, and—" "That wouldn't affect her father or me," said Mrs. Baines quickly. "Certainly not. I merely say that she is very much set on it. Yes, she would at any rate make a teacher far superior to the average. That girl has got the better of her mother without me," she reflected. "Ah, here is dear Constance." Constance, tempted beyond her strength by the sounds of the visit and the colloquy, had slipped into the room. "I've left both doors open, mother," she excused herself for quitting her father, and kissed Miss Chetwynd. She blushed, but she blushed happily, and really made a most creditable debut as a young lady. Her mother rewarded her by taking her into the conversation, and history was soon made. So Sophia was apprenticed to Miss Aileen Chetwynd. Mrs. Baines bore herself greatly. It was Miss Chetwynd who had urged, and her respect for Miss Chetwynd. Also, somehow, the Reverend Archibald Jones came into the cause. Of course, the idea of Sophia ever going to London was ridiculous. Ridiculous! Mrs. Baines secretly feared that the ridiculous might happen, but with the Reverend Archibald Jones on the spot, the worst could be faced. Sophia must understand that even the apprenticeship in Bursley was merely a trial. They would see how things went on. She had to thank Miss Chetwynd. "I made Miss Chetwynd come and talk to mother," said Sophia magnificently one night to simple Constance, as if to imply, "Your Miss Chetwynd is my washpot." To Constance, Sophia's mere enterprise was just as staggering as her success. Fancy her deliberately going out that Saturday morning after her mother's definite decision to enlist Miss Chetwynd in her aid. There is no need to insist on the tragic grandeur of Mrs. Baines's renunciation, a renunciation which implied her acceptance of a change in the balance of power in her realm. Part of its tragedy was that none, not even Constance, could divine the intensity of Mrs. Baines's suffering. She had no confidant, she was incapable of showing a wound. But when she lay awake at night by the organism which had once been her husband, she dwelt long and deeply on the martyrdom of her life. What had she done to deserve it? Always had she conscientiously endeavoured to be kind, just, patient, and she knew herself to be sagacious and prudent. In the frightful and unguessed trials of her existence as a wife, surely she might have been granted consolations as a mother. Yet no, it had not been. And she felt all the bitterness of age against youth. Youth egotistic, harsh, cruel, uncompromising. Youth that is so crude, so ignorant of life, so slow to understand. She had Constance, yes, but it would be 20 years before Constance could appreciate the sacrifice of judgment and of pride which her mother had made, in a sudden decision, during that rambling, starched, simpering interview with Miss Aileen Chetwynd. Probably Constance thought that she had yielded to Sophia's passionate temper. Impossible to explain to Constance that she had yielded to nothing but a perception of Sophia's complete inability to hear reason and wisdom. Sometimes as she lay in the dark, she would, in fancy, snatch her heart from her bosom and fling it down before Sophia, bleeding, and cry, "See what I carry about with me on your account." Then she would take it back and hide it again, and sweeten her bitterness with wise admonitions to herself. All this because Sophia, aware that if she stayed in the house she would be compelled to help in the shop, chose an honourable activity which freed her from the danger. Heart, how absurd of you to bleed. End of chapter 3. Book 1, Chapter 4 of The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. Book 1, Mrs. Baines. Chapter 4 Elephant 1. Sophia, will you come and see the elephant? Do come. Constance entered the drawing-room with this request on her eager lips. No, said Sophia with a touch of condescension. I'm far too busy for elephants. Only 2 years had passed, but both girls were grown up now. Long sleeves, long skirts, hair that had settled down in life, and a demeanour immensely serious, as though existence were terrific in its responsibilities. Yet sometimes childhood surprisingly broke through the crust of gravity, as now in Constance, aroused by such things as elephants, and proclaimed with vivacious gestures that it was not dead after all. The sisters were sharply differentiated. Constance wore the black alpaca apron and the scissors at the end of a long black elastic, which indicated her vocation in the shop. She was proving a considerable success in the millinery department. She had learned how to talk to people, and was, in her modest way, very self-possessed. She was getting a little stouter. Everybody liked her. Sophia had developed into the student. Time had accentuated her reserve. Her sole friend was Miss Chetwynd, with whom she was, having regard to the disparity of their ages, very intimate. At home she spoke little. She lacked amiability, as her mother said. She was touchy. She required diplomacy from others, but did not render it again. Her attitude, indeed, was one of half-hidden disdain, now gentle, now coldly bitter. She would not wear an apron, in an age when aprons were almost essential to decency. No, she would not wear an apron, and there was an end of it. She was not so tidy as Constance. And if Constance's hands had taken on the coarse texture which comes from commerce with needles, pins, artificial flowers, and stuffs, Sophia's fine hands were seldom innocent of ink. But Sophia was splendidly beautiful, and even her mother and Constance had an instinctive idea that that face was at any rate a partial excuse for her asperity. "Well," said Constance, "if you won't, I do believe I shall ask mother if she will." Sophia, bending over her books, made no answer, but the top of her head said, "This has no interest to me whatever." Constance left the room, and in a moment returned with her mother. "Sophia," said her mother with gay excitement, "you might go up and sit with your father for a bit, while Constance and I just run up to the playground to see the elephant. You can work just as well in there as here. Your father's asleep." "Oh, very well," Sophia agreed haughtily. "Whatever is all this fuss about an elephant? Anyhow, it'll be quieter in your room. The noise here is splitting." She gave a supercilious glance into the square as she languidly rose. It was the morning of the 3rd day of Bursley Wakes, not the modern finicking and respectable, but an orgiastic carnival, gross in all its manifestations of joy. The whole centre of the town was given over to the furious pleasures of the people. Most of the square was occupied by Wombwell's menagerie in a vast oblong tent, whose raging beasts roared and growled day and night. And spreading away from this supreme attraction, right up through the market-place, past the town hall, to Duck Bank, Duck Square, and the wasteland called the playground, were hundreds of booths, with banners displaying all the delights of the horrible. You could see the atrocities of the French Revolution and of the Fiji Islands, and the ravages of unspeakable diseases, and the living flesh of a nearly nude human female, guaranteed to turn the scale at 22 stone, and the skeletons of the mysterious phantascope, and the bloody contests of champions naked to the waist, with the chance of picking up a red tooth as a relic. You could try your strength by hitting an image of a fellow creature in the stomach, and test your aim by knocking off the heads of other images with a wooden ball. You could also shoot with rifles at various targets. All the streets were lined with stalls loaded with food in heaps, chiefly dried fish, the entrails of animals, and gingerbread. All the public houses were crammed, and frenzied, jolly drunkards, men and women, lunged along the pavements everywhere, their shouts vying with the trumpets, horns, and drums of the booths, and the shrieking, rattling toys that the children carried. It was a glorious spectacle, but not a spectacle for the leading families. Miss Jetwin's school was closed, so that the daughters of leading families might remain in seclusion till the worst was over. The Baineses ignored the Wakes in every possible way, choosing that week to have a show of mourning goods in the left-hand window, and refusing to let Maggie outside on any pretext. Therefore the dazzling social success of the Elephant, which was quite easily drawing Mrs. Baines into the vortex, cannot imaginably be overestimated. On the previous night, one of the three Wombwell elephants had suddenly knelt on a man in the tent. He had then walked out of the tent and picked up another man at haphazard from the crowd which was staring at the great pictures in front, and tried to put this second man into his mouth. Being stopped by his Indian attendant with a pitchfork, he placed the man on the ground and stuck his tusk through an artery of the victim's arm. He then, amid unexampled excitement, suffered himself to be led away. He was conducted to the rear of the tent, just in front of Baines's shuttered windows, and by means of stakes, pulleys, and ropes, forced to his knees. His head was whitewashed, and 6 men of the Rifle Corps were engaged to shoot at him at a distance of 5 yards, while constables kept the crowd off with truncheons. He died instantly, rolling over with a soft thud. The crowd cheered, and, intoxicated by their importance, the volunteers fired 3 more volleys into his carcass, and were then borne off as heroes to different inns. The Elephant, by the help of his 2 companions, was got on to a railway lorry and disappeared into the night. Such was the greatest sensation that has ever occurred, or perhaps will ever occur, in Bursley. The excitement about the repeal of the Corn Laws, or about Inkerman, was feeble compared to that excitement. Mr. Critchlow, who had been called on to put a hasty tourniquet round the arm of the second victim, had popped in afterwards to tell John Baines all about it. Mr. Baines's interest, however, had been slight. Mr. Critchlow succeeded better with the ladies, who, though they had witnessed the shooting from the drawing-room, were thirsty for the most trifling details. The next day it was known that the Elephant lay near the playground, pending the decision of the chief bailiff and the medical officer as to his burial, and everybody had to visit the corpse. No social exclusiveness could withstand the seduction of that dead elephant. Pilgrims travelled from all the 5 towns to see him. "We're going now," said Mrs. Baines, after she had assumed her bonnet and shawl. "All right," said Sophia, pretending to be absorbed in study, as she sat on the sofa at the foot of her father's bed; and Constance, having put her head in at the door, drew her mother after her like a magnet. Then Sophia heard a remarkable conversation in the passage. "Are you going up to see the Elephant, Mrs. Baines?" asked the voice of Mr. Povey. "Yes. Why? I think I had better come with you. The crowd is sure to be very rough." Mr. Povey's tone was firm. He had a position. "But the shop—" "We shall not be long," said Mr. Povey. "Oh, yes, mother," Constance added appealingly. Sophia felt the house thrill as the side door banged. She sprang up and watched the 3 cross King Street diagonally, and so plunge into the Wakes. This triple departure was surely the crowning tribute to the dead elephant. It was simply astonishing. It caused Sophia to perceive that she had miscalculated the importance of the elephant. It made her regret her scorn of the elephant as an attraction. She was left behind, and the joy of life was calling her. She could see down into the vaults on the opposite side of the street, where working men, potters, and colliers, in their best clothes, some with high hats, were drinking, gesticulating, and laughing in a row at a long counter. She noticed, while she was thus at the bedroom window, a young man ascending King Street, followed by a porter trundling a flat barrow of luggage. He passed slowly under the very window. She flushed. She had evidently been startled by the sight of this young man into no ordinary state of commotion. She glanced at the books on the sofa, and then at her father. Mr. Baines, thin and gaunt and acutely pitiable, still slept. His brain had almost ceased to be active now. He had to be fed and tended like a bearded baby, and he would sleep for hours at a stretch, even in the daytime. Sophia left the room. A moment later she ran into the shop, an apparition that amazed the three young lady assistants. At the corner near the window, on the fancy side, a little nook had been formed by screening off a portion of the counter with large flower boxes placed end up. This corner had come to be known as Miss Baines's corner. Sophia hastened to it, squeezing past a young lady assistant in the narrow space between the back of the counter and the shelf-lined wall. She sat down in Constance's chair, and pretended to look for something. She had examined herself in the cheval glass in the showroom on her way from the sick chamber. When she heard a voice near the door of the shop asking first for Mr. Povey and then for Mrs. Baines, she rose, and seizing the object nearest to her, which happened to be a pair of scissors, she hurried towards the showroom stairs, as though the scissors had been a grail passionately sought and to be jealously hidden away. She wanted to stop and turn round, but something prevented her. She was at the end of the counter under the curving stairs, when one of the assistants said, I suppose you don't know when Mr. Povey or your mother are likely to be back, Miss Sophia? Here's... It was a divine release for Sophia. She stammered, turning round abruptly. Luckily she was still sheltered behind the counter. The young man, whom she had seen in the street, came boldly forward. "Good morning, Miss Sophia," said he, hat in hand. "It's a long time since I had the pleasure of seeing you." Never had she blushed as she blushed then. She scarcely knew what she was doing as she moved slowly towards her sister's corner again, the young man following her on the customer's side of the counter. 2. She knew that he was a traveller for the most renowned and gigantic of all Manchester wholesale firms, Birkinshaw's, but she did not know his name, which was Gerald Scales. He was a rather short but extremely well-proportioned man of 30, with fair hair and a distinguished appearance, as became a representative of Birkinshaw's. His broad, tight necktie, with an edge of white collar showing above it, was particularly elegant. He had been on the road for Birkinshaw's for several years, but Sophia had only seen him once before in her life, when she was a little girl 3 years ago. The relations between the travellers of the great firms and their solid, sure clients in small towns were in those days often cordially intimate. The traveller came with the lustre of a historic reputation around him. There was no need to fawn for orders, and the client's immense and immaculate respectability made him the equal of no matter what ambassador. It was a case of mutual esteem, and of that confidence-generating phenomenon, an old account. The tone in which a commercial traveller of middle age would utter the phrase "an old account" revealed in a flash all that was romantic, prim, and stately in mid-Victorian commerce. In the days of Baines, after one of the elaborately engraved advice circulars had arrived, "Our Mr. So-and-so will have the pleasure of waiting upon you on whatever it is day next, the something or other inst." John might in certain cases be expected to say on the morning of whatever day, "Missus, what have you gotten for supper tonight?" Mr. Gerald Scales had never been asked to supper. He had never even seen John Baines, but as the youthful successor of an aged traveller who had had the pleasure of St. Luke's Square on behalf of Birkinshaw's since before railways, Mrs. Baines had treated him with a faint agreeable touch of maternal familiarity, and both her daughters being once in the shop during his visit, she had on that occasion commanded the gawky girls to shake hands with him. Sophia had never forgotten that glimpse. The young man without a name had lived in her mind, brightly glowing, as the very symbol and incarnation of the masculine and the elegant. The renewed sight of him seemed to have wakened her out of a sleep. Assuredly she was not the same Sophia. As she sat in her sister's chair in the corner, entrenched behind the perpendicular boxes, playing nervously with the scissors, her beautiful face was transfigured into the ravishingly angelic. It would have been impossible for Mr. Gerald Scales or anybody else to credit, as he gazed at those lovely, sensitive, vivacious, responsive features, that Sophia was not a character of heavenly sweetness and perfection. She did not know what she was doing. She was nothing but the exquisite expression of a deep instinct to attract and charm. Her soul itself emanated from her in an atmosphere of allurement and acquiescence. Could those laughing lips hang in a heavy pout? Could that delicate and mild voice be harsh? Could those burning eyes be coldly inimical? Never. The idea was inconceivable. And Mr. Gerald Scales, with his head over the top of the boxes, yielded to the spell. Remarkable that Mr. Gerald Scales, with all his experience, should have had to come to Bursley to find the pearl, the paragon, the ideal. But so it was. They met in an equal abandonment. The only difference between them was that Mr. Scales, by force of habit, kept his head. "I see it is your Wakes here," said he. He was polite to the Wakes, but now, with the least inflection in the world, he put the Wakes at its proper level in the scheme of things, as a local unimportance. She adored him for this. She was athirst for sympathy in the task of scorning everything local. "I expect you didn't know," she said, implying that there was every reason why a man of his mundane interests should not know. "I should have remembered if I had thought," said he, "but I didn't think. What's this about an elephant?" "Oh," she exclaimed, "have you heard of that? My porter was full of it. Well," she said, "of course it's a very big thing in Bursley." As she smiled in gentle pity of poor Bursley, he naturally did the same, and he thought how much more advanced and broad the younger generation was than the old. He would never have dared to express his real feelings about Bursley to Mrs. Baines, or even to Mr. Povey, who was, however, of no generation. Yet here was a young woman actually sharing them. She told him all the history of the elephant. "Must have been very exciting," he commented, despite himself. "Do you know," she replied, "it was." After all, Bursley was climbing in their opinion. "And my mother and my sister and Mr. Povey have all gone to see it. That's why they're not here." That the elephant should have caused both Mr. Povey and Mrs. Baines to forget that the representative of Birkinshaw's was due to call was indeed a final victory for the elephant. "But not you!" he exclaimed. "No," she said, "not me." "Why didn't you go?" He continued his flattering investigations with a generous smile. "I simply didn't care to," said she, proudly nonchalant. "And I suppose you're in charge here?" "No," she answered, "I just happened to have run down here for these scissors, that's all." "I often see your sister," said he. "Often do I say, that is generally when I come, but never you." "I'm never in the shop," she said. "It's just an accident to-day." "Oh, so you leave the shop to your sister?" "Yes." She said nothing of her teaching. Then there was a silence. Sophia was very thankful to be hidden from the curiosity of the shop. The shop could see nothing of her, and only the back of the young man, and the conversation had been conducted in low voices. She tapped her foot, stared at the worn, polished surface of the counter with the brass yard measure nailed along its edge, and then she uneasily turned her gaze to the left, and seemed to be examining the backs of the black bonnets which were perched on high stands in the great window. Then her eyes caught his for an important moment. "Yes," she breathed. Somebody had to say something. If the shop missed the murmur of their voices, the shop would wonder what had happened to them. Mr. Scales looked at his watch. "I dare say if I come in again about 2, he began. "Oh yes, they're sure to be in then," she burst out, before he could finish his sentence. He left abruptly, queerly, without shaking hands. But then it would have been difficult, she argued, for him to have put his arm over the boxes, and without expressing the hope of seeing her again. She peeped through the black bonnets, and saw the porter put the leather strap over his shoulders, raise the rear of the barrow, and trundle off. But she did not see Mr. Scales. She was drunk. Thoughts were tumbling about in her brain like cargo loose in a rolling ship. Her entire conception of herself was being altered. Her attitude towards life was being altered. The thought which knocked hardest against its fellows was, "Only in these moments have I begun to live." And as she flitted upstairs to resume watch over her father, she sought to devise an innocent-looking method by which she might see Mr. Scales when he next called, and she speculated as to what his name was. 3. When Sophia arrived in the bedroom, she was startled because her father's head and beard were not in their accustomed place on the pillow. She could only make out something vaguely unusual sloping off the side of the bed. A few seconds passed, not to be measured in time, and she saw that the upper part of his body had slipped down, and his head was hanging inverted near the floor between the bed and the ottoman. His face, neck, and hands were dark and congested. His mouth was open, and the tongue protruded through the black, swollen, mucous lips. His eyes were prominent and coldly staring. The fact was that Mr. Baines had wakened up, and, being restless, had slid out partially from his bed, and died of asphyxia. After having been unceasingly watched for 14 years, he had, with an invalid's natural perverseness, taken advantage of Sophia's brief dereliction to expire. Say what you will, amid Sophia's horror and her terrible grief and shame, she had visitings of the idea that he did it on purpose. She ran out from the room, knowing by intuition that he was dead, and shrieked out, "Maggie!" at the top of her voice. The house echoed. "Yes, miss," said Maggie, quite close, coming out of Mr. Povey's chamber with a slop pail. "Fetch Mr. Critchlow at once. Be quick, just as you are. It's father." Maggie, perceiving darkly that disaster was in the air, and instantly filled with importance and a sort of black joy, dropped her pail in the exact middle of the passage, and almost fell down the crooked stairs. One of Maggie's deepest instincts, always held in check by the stern dominance of Mrs. Baines, was to leave pails prominent on the main roots of the house, and now, divining what was at hand, it flamed into insurrection. No sleepless night had ever been so long to Sophia as the 3 minutes which elapsed before Mr. Critchlow came. As she stood on the mat outside the bedroom door, she tried to draw her mother and Constance and Mr. Povey by magnetic force out of the wakes into the house, and her muscles were contracted in this strange effort. She felt that it was impossible to continue living if the secret of the bedroom remained unknown 1 instant longer, so intense was her torture, and yet that the torture which could not be borne must be borne. Not a sound in the house, not a sound from the shop, only the distant murmur of the wakes. "Why did I forget father?" she asked herself with awe. "I only meant to tell him that they were all out and run back. Why did I forget father?" She would never be able to persuade anybody that she had literally forgotten her father's existence for quite 10 minutes, but it was true, though shocking. Then there were noises downstairs. "Bless us, bless us!" came the unpleasant voice of Mr. Critchlow, as he bounded up the stairs on his long legs. He strode over the pail. "What's amiss?" He was wearing his white apron, and he carried his spectacles in his bony hand. "It's father. He's..." Sophia faltered. She stood away so that he should enter the room first. He glanced at her keenly, and as it were resentfully, and went in. She followed timidly, remaining near the door while Mr. Critchlow inspected her handiwork. He put on his spectacles with strange deliberation, and then, bending his knees outwards, thus lowered his body so that he could examine John Baines point blank. He remained staring like this, his hands on his sharp, apron-covered knees, for a little space, and then he seized the inert mass and restored it to the bed, and wiped those clotted lips with his apron. Sophia heard loud breathing behind her. It was Maggie. She heard a huge snorting sob. Maggie was showing her emotion. "Go fetch doctor," Mr. Critchlow rasped, "and don't stand gaping there." "Run for the doctor, Maggie," said Sophia. "How come you to let him fall?" Mr. Critchlow demanded. "I was out of the room. I just ran down into the shop." "Gallivanting with that young Scales," said Mr. Critchlow with devilish ferocity. "Well, you've killed your father, that's all." He must have been at his shop door and seen the entry of the traveller, and it was precisely characteristic of Mr. Critchlow to jump in the dark at a horrible conclusion, and to be right after all. For Sophia, Mr. Critchlow had always been the personification of malignity and malevolence, and now these qualities in him made him, to her, almost obscene. Her pride brought up tremendous reinforcements, and she approached the bed. "Is he dead?" she asked in a quiet tone. Somewhere within a voice was whispering, "So his name is Scales." "Don't I tell you he's dead?" "Pail on the stairs!" This mild exclamation came from the passage. Mrs. Baines, misliking the crowds abroad, had returned alone. She had left Constance in charge of Mr. Povey. Coming into her house by the shop and showroom, she had first noted the phenomenon of the pail, proof of her theory of Maggie's incurable untidiness. "Been to see the elephant, I reckon?" said Mr. Critchlow in fierce sarcasm, as he recognised Mrs. Baines's voice. Sophia leapt towards the door, as though to bar her mother's entrance, but Mrs. Baines was already opening the door. "Well, my pet," she was beginning cheerfully. Mr. Critchlow confronted her, and he had no more pity for the wife than for the daughter. He was furiously angry because his precious property had been irretrievably damaged by the momentary carelessness of a silly girl. Yes, John Baines was his property, his dearest toy. He was convinced that he alone had kept John Baines alive for 14 years, that he alone had fully understood the case and sympathised with the sufferer, that none but he had been capable of displaying ordinary common sense in the sick-room. He had learned to regard John Baines as, in some sort, his creation, and now, with their stupidity, their neglect, their elephants, between them, they had done for John Baines. He had always known that it would come to that, and it had come to that. "She let him fall out of bed, and you're a widder now, missus," he announced, with a virulence hardly conceivable. His angular features and dark eyes expressed a murderous hate for every woman named Baines. "Mother," cried Sophia, "I only ran down into the shop to... She seized her mother's arm in frenzied agony. "My child," cried Mrs. Baines, rising miraculously to the situation with a calm benevolence of tone and gesture that remained for ever sublime in the stormy heart of Sophia, "do not hold me." With infinite gentleness she loosed herself from those clasping hands. "Have you sent for the doctor?" she questioned Mr. Critchlow. The fate of her husband presented no mysteries to Mrs. Baines. Everybody had been warned 1,000 times of the danger of leaving the paralytic, whose life depended on his position, and whose fidgetiness was therefore a constant menace of death to him. For 5,000 nights she had wakened infallibly every time he stirred, and rearranged him by the flicker of a little oil lamp. But Sophia, unhappy creature, had merely left him. That was all. Mr. Critchlow and the widow gazed, helplessly waiting, at the pitiable corpse, of which the salient part was the white beard. They knew not that they were gazing at a vanished era. John Baines had belonged to the past, to the age when men really did think of their souls, when orators by phrases could move crowds to fury or to pity, when no one had learnt to hurry, when Demos was only turning in his sleep, when the sole beauty of life resided in its inflexible and slow dignity, when hell really had no bottom, and a gilt-clasped Bible really was the secret of England's greatness. Mid-Victorian England lay on that mahogany bed. Ideals had passed away with John Baines. It is thus that ideals die, not in the conventional pageantry of honoured death, but sorrily, ignobly, while one's head is turned. And Mr. Povey and Constance, very self-conscious, went and saw the dead elephant, and came back. And at the corner of King Street, Constance exclaimed brightly, "Why, who's gone out and left the side door open?" For the doctor had at length arrived, and Maggie, in showing him upstairs with pious haste, had forgotten to shut the door. And they took advantage of the side door, rather guiltily, to avoid the eyes of the shop. They feared that in the parlour they would be the centre of a curiosity half ironical and half reproving. For had they not accomplished an escapade? So they walked slowly. The real murderer was having his dinner in the commercial room up at the Tiger, opposite the Town Hall. 4. Several shutters were put up in the windows of the shop to indicate a death, and the news instantly became known in trading circles throughout the town. Many people simultaneously remarked on the coincidence that Mr. Baines should have died while there was a show of mourning goods in his establishment. This coincidence was regarded as extremely sinister, and it was apparently felt that, for the sake of the mind's peace, one ought not to inquire into such things too closely. From the moment of putting up the prescribed shutters, John Baines and his funeral began to acquire importance in Bursley, and their importance grew rapidly, almost from hour to hour. The wakes continued as usual, except that the Chief Constable, upon representations being made to him by Mr. Critchlow and other citizens, descended upon St. Luke's Square, and forbade the activities of Wombwell's orchestra. Wombwell and the Chief Constable differed as to the justice of the decree, but every well-minded person praised the Chief Constable, and he himself considered that he had enhanced the town's reputation for a decent propriety. It was noticed too, not without a shiver of the uncanny, that night the lions and tigers behaved like lambs, whereas on the previous night they had roared the whole square out of its sleep. The Chief Constable was not the only individual enlisted by Mr. Critchlow in the service of his friend's fame. Mr. Critchlow spent hours in recalling the principal citizens to a due sense of John Baines's past greatness. He was determined that his treasured toy should vanish underground with due pomp, and he left nothing undone to that end. He went over to Hanbridge on the still wonderful horse-car, and saw the editor-proprietor of the Staffordshire Signal, then a twopenny weekly with no thought of football editions. And on the very day of the funeral the Signal came out with a long and eloquent biography of John Baines. This biography, giving details of his public life, definitely restored him to his legitimate position in the civic memory as an ex-chief bailiff, an ex-chairman of the Burial Board, and of the Five Towns Association for the Advancement of Useful Knowledge, and also as a prime mover in the Local Turnpike Act, in the negotiations for the new Town Hall, and in the Corinthian facade of the Wesleyan Chapel. It narrated the anecdote of his courageous speech from the portico of the Shambles during the riots of 1848, and it did not omit a eulogy of his steady adherence to the wise old English maxims of commerce and his avoidance of dangerous modern methods. Even in the 60s the modern had reared its shameless head. The panegyric closed with an appreciation of the dead man's fortitude in the terrible affliction with which a divine providence had seen fit to try him. And finally the Signal uttered its absolute conviction that his native town would raise a cenotaph to his honour. Mr. Critchlow, being unfamiliar with the word cenotaph, consulted Worcester's dictionary, and when he found that it meant a sepulchral monument to one who is buried elsewhere, he was as pleased with the Signal's language as the idea, and decided that a cenotaph should come to pass. The house and shop were transformed into a hive of preparation for the funeral. All was changed. Mr. Povey kindly slept for 3 nights on the parlour sofa, in order that Mrs. Baines might have his room. The funeral grew into an obsession, for multitudinous things had to be performed, and done sumptuously and in strict accordance with precedent. There were the family mourning, the funeral repast, the choice of the text on the memorial card, the composition of the legend on the coffin, the legal arrangements, the letters to relations, the selection of guests, and the question of bell-ringing, hearse, plumes, number of horses, and grave-digging. Nobody had leisure for the indulgence of grief except Aunt Maria, who, after she had helped in the laying out, simply sat down and bemoaned unceasingly for hours her absence on the fatal morning. "If I hadn't been so fixed on polishing my candlesticks," she weepingly repeated, "he might have been alive and well now." Not that Aunt Maria had been informed of the precise circumstances of the death. She was not clearly aware that Mr. Baines had died through a piece of neglect. But, like Mr. Critchlow, she was convinced that there had been only one person in the world truly capable of nursing Mr. Baines. Beyond the family, no one save Mr. Critchlow and Dr. Harrop knew just how the martyr had finished his career. Dr. Harrop, having been asked bluntly if an inquest would be necessary, had reflected a moment, and then replied, "No," and he added, "Least said, soonest mended. Mark me." They had marked him. He was common sense in breeches. As for Aunt Maria, she was sent about her snivelling business by Aunt Harriet. The arrival in the house of this genuine aunt from Axe, of the majestic and enormous widow, whom even the imperial Mrs. Baines regarded with a certain awe, set a seal of ultimate solemnity on the whole event. In Mr. Povey's bedroom, Mrs. Baines fell like a child into Aunt Harriet's arms, and sobbed, "If it had been anything but that elephant!" Such was Mrs. Baines's sole weakness, from first to last. Aunt Harriet was an exhaustless fountain of authority upon every detail concerning interments, and to a series of questions ending with the word "sister," and answers ending with the word "sister," the prodigious travail incident to the funeral was gradually and successfully accomplished. Dress and the repast exceeded all other matters in complexity and difficulty. But on the morning of the funeral, Aunt Harriet had the satisfaction of beholding her younger sister the centre of a tremendous cocoon of crape, whose slightest pleat was perfect. Aunt Harriet seemed to welcome her then, like a veteran, formally into the august army of relicts. As they stood side by side, surveying the special table which was being laid in the showroom for the repast, it appeared inconceivable that they had reposed together in Mr. Povey's limited bed. They descended from the showroom to the kitchen, where the last delicate dishes were inspected. The shop was of course closed for the day, but Mr. Povey was busy there, and in Aunt Harriet's all-seeing glance he came next after the dishes. She rose from the kitchen to speak with him. "You've got your boxes of gloves all ready?" she questioned him. "Yes, Mrs. Maddock." "You'll not forget to have a measure handy?" "No, Mrs. Maddock." "You'll find you want more of 7 3/4 and 8s than anything?" "Yes, I have allowed for that." "If you'll place yourself behind the side door and put your boxes on the harmonium, you'll be able to catch everyone as they come in." "That is what I had thought of, Mrs. Maddock." She went upstairs again. Mrs. Baines had reached the showroom again, and was smoothing out creases in the white damask cloth and arranging glass dishes of jam at equal distances from each other. "Come, sister," said Mrs. Maddock. "A last look." And they passed into the mortuary bedroom, to gaze at Mr. Baines before he should be everlastingly nailed down. In death he had recovered some of his earlier dignity, but even so he was a startling sight. The two widows bent over him, one on either side, and gravely stared at that twisted, worn, white face, all neatly tucked up in linen. "I shall fetch Constance and Sophia," said Mrs. Maddock, with tears in her voice. "Do you go into the drawing-room, sister." But Mrs. Maddock only succeeded in fetching Constance. Then there was the sound of wheels in King Street. The long rite of the funeral was about to begin. Every guest, after having been measured and presented with a pair of the finest black kid gloves by Mr. Povey, had to mount the crooked stairs and gaze upon the carcass of John Baines, going afterwards to the drawing-room to condole briefly with the widow. And every guest, while conscious of the enormity of so thinking, thought what an excellent thing it was that John Baines should be at last dead and gone. The tramping on the stairs was continual, and finally Mr. Baines himself went downstairs, bumping against corners, and led a cortège of 20 vehicles. The funeral tea was not over at 7 o'clock, 5 hours after the commencement of the rite. It was a gigantic and faultless meal, worthy of John Baines's distant past. Only 2 persons were absent from it, John Baines and Sophia. The emptiness of Sophia's chair was much noticed. Mrs. Maddock explained that Sophia was very high-strung and could not trust herself. Great efforts were put forth by the company to be lugubrious and inconsolable, but the secret relief resulting from the death would not be entirely hidden. The vast pretence of acute sorrow could not stand intact against that secret relief and the lavish richness of the food. To the offending of sundry important relatives from a distance, Mr. Critchlow informally presided over that assemblage of grave men in high stocks and crinolined women. He had closed his shop, which had never before been closed on a weekday, and he had a great deal to say about this extraordinary closure. It was due as much to the elephant as to the funeral. The elephant had become a victim to the craze for souvenirs. Already in the night his tusks had been stolen. Then his feet disappeared for umbrella stands, and most of his flesh had departed in little hunks. Everybody in Bursley had resolved to participate in the elephant. One consequence was that all the chemists' shops in the towns were assaulted by strings of boys. "Please, a penn'orth of alum to take smell out of a bit of elephant." Mr. Critchlow hated boys,
'I'll allum you,' says I. And I did. I allummed him out of my shop with a pestle. If there'd been one, there'd have been 20 between opening and 9 o'clock. 'George,' I says to my apprentice, 'shut shop up. My old friend John Baines is going to his long home to day, and I'll close. I've had enough of allum for one day.' The elephant fed the conversation until after the second relay of hot muffins. When Mr. Critchlow had eaten to his capacity, he took the Signal importantly from his pocket, posed his spectacles, and read the obituary all through in slow, impressive accents. Before he reached the end, Mrs. Baines began to perceive that familiarity had blinded her to the heroic qualities of her late husband. The 14 years of ceaseless care were now quite genuinely forgotten, and she saw him in his strength and in his glory. When Mr. Critchlow arrived at the eulogy of the husband and father, Mrs. Baines rose and left the showroom. The guests looked at each other in sympathy for her. Mr. Critchlow shot a glance at her over his spectacles, and continued steadily reading. After he had finished, he approached the question of the cenotaph. Mrs. Baines, driven from the banquet by her feelings, went into the drawing-room. Sophia was there, and Sophia, seeing tears in her mother's eyes, gave a sob, and flung herself bodily against her mother, clutching her, and hiding her face in that broad crape which abraded her soft skin. "Mother," she wept passionately, "I want to leave the school now. I want to please you. I'll do anything in the world to please you. I'll go into the shop if you'd like me to." Her voice lost itself in tears. "Calm yourself, my pet," said Mrs. Baines, tenderly caressing her. It was a triumph for the mother, in the very hour when she needed a triumph. End of Chapter 4.